I'd like to
Excellent.
introduce Hollis Robbins, one of my Clubhouse friends. She and I have never met personally, but we've really grown a liking for science and science fiction as we talk about it from two different perspectives. And it's just wonderful to be able to do that. So Hollis, let me have you get going and give us a start.
All right, let me start sharing my screen here, and I will just say was so delighted when you invited me to do this with you. Let me figure out how to do this because after all these years of COVID, I'm still not as good as I've been on the technology. But it's so exciting meeting you on Clubhouse, our science fiction talk on Sunday nights, and it's a worldwide endeavor, worldwide people
It
coming
is.
together every week to talk about science fiction and to focus here on the science fiction history of Mars. And this, just to start with this, why don't you explain what these pictures are, Jim?
Indeed, Galileo, who used his telescope at the beginning of that era of building this wonderful technology and looking into the heavens at night, was uncovering all sorts of things. And he did see Mars, but he couldn't make out any features. It really took another 40 or so years. He did this in something like 1611 to really look at it. But in 40 years, the ability to build telescopes and make them so powerful was coming on that then they could actually resolve features on Mars. And it was really Christian Huygens that really made the first sketches of Mars in 1659, as you see here. And Hollis has done a great job mapping those features to what we think he was really looking at the time. Now, what was exciting about these images as they were being created and then handed out is other scientists like Giovanni Cassini, well-known scientist, was looking at them and saying, "Gee, these dark areas. If Mars is much like Earth, dark areas on Earth must be oceans, and therefore maybe there's a lot of water on Mars." And that really started the concept of what life might be like on another planet.
And this idea of science and fiction, most of our conversations, as it will be today, have been about the fiction. I mean, the fiction of exploration, the fiction of seafaring voyages or exploring new places from the Odyssey, from our oldest. We're going to focus a little bit on the Western tradition, but this is across the planet. Exploration narratives have been always a huge part of fiction. So why not transport that to Mars? Just trying to get here. I think the biggest moment that structures science fiction at least in the Western tradition, was 3 books by Percival Lowell, who lived from 1855 to 1916, who had 3 key books: Mars, 1895, Mars and its Canals, and Mars is the Abode of Life. And do you want to jump in on those?
Indeed, Percival Lowell was a well-known scientist, and he was taking observations that Schiaparelli was making and folding them into his observations. Schiaparelli saw these lines, as we saw on the previous slide, and called them canali, which means just grooves, something natural done. But Percival Lowell translated that into canals, which are dug by intelligent life. So now we still retain that life connection. Even the scientists were hanging on to that. And of course, what happens next is the War of the Worlds.
Right. I mean, these 2 really key science fiction innovators. So H.G. Wells in 1898 with War of the Worlds, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, who most people know from Tarzan, also had the Barsoom series. John Carter was the kind of funky movie from 2012. But these 2 figures read Percival Lowell and created these books that you could see the ripple effect down through the history of Western sci-fi: Martian Chronicles from Ray Bradbury, Star Wars, and Avatar. Let me see if I can, I'm still having a hard time getting, oh, there we go. So, oh, this isn't where we want. So here we go. To think about in sort of going forward from this moment, we can organize Mars sci-fi narratives in sort of three categories. The first being Martians coming to Earth, which it's an interesting the fact that it's a smaller category than the other categories. Two is Earth astronauts going to Mars, which we'll see is the bulk of our sci-fi narratives. And third being stories of life on Mars as normal. And then in the middle part, these Earth astronauts going to Mars narratives, there's two sorts. There's the speculative that doesn't care about the science. So there's aliens on Mars, all sorts of wacky things, finding evidence of ancient life or monsters. And then the realistic ones that really marry the drama of technological success and failure, and shipwreck and survival. But in this beginning, to start from the beginning, Martians coming to Earth was where sci-fi started. So first we would see War of the Worlds, as we were saying, and Wells read, Lowell, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, Lowell's first book on Mars talked about the canals that he was observing, continually pushing the concept that intelligent life was there. And of course, canals, the concept for Percival Lowell is, well, you're using canals to bring water from one place to another place. So that means intelligent life on the planet Mars must need water. So where are you going to go to get the most water? To the blue planet.
And this has been such a dominant narrative, the War of the Worlds, which we in the great radio play that scared everybody, and then the great 2005 movie, which really took the same illustrations of what these Martians, these tripods, would look like. But it's interesting that there aren't so many narratives of Martians coming to Earth. The second really big one was Mars Attacks, the movie in 1996, which takes as its sort of aesthetic the day the Earth stood still in 1950, which they don't explicitly say that he's from Mars, but as the newspaper clip shows, he's quite clearly from Mars. And this is, interestingly, many people's favorite Mars movie, even though we really only see Mars in the distance there. So the bulk of the movies of our science fiction, and we're focusing on movies because this is a visual medium and that's how most people know them, but is the film industry. And in the beginning, sort of before science and the science of Mars really got going in the 1950s, we had movies like Just Imagine from 1930s, a pre-Hays Code film, which the science is crazy, but they have things like flying cars, which we don't have today, rockets that go to the moon, to Mars, conversations with Martians. So there's no really scientific reality at all. And yet, right, the speculation on what it could be there was something that sci-fi did. And then comes around the 1950s.
Yeah, at that particular time, of course, NASA had acquired a whole cadre of German scientists that were involved in rocketry, and von Braun, who led that, was really big into imagining, indeed, going to Mars in particular. He wrote a series of articles in Collier about how to do that, even during a time when some scientists didn't think traveling between planets was too practical. But indeed, the book The Mars Project, which he developed in the early 50s, was all about the hard, rigorous mathematics on how to get to Mars, how to land on Mars, how to orbit Mars, and how to take humans to that red planet.
And we see very much that the ways that scientific inquiry was driving the narrative inquiry, most famously and most influentially, Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, that began in 1950, continued for several years after, and was made into a made-for-TV movie in 1980, starring Rock Hudson. And we see a kind of interesting assumption again that our technology would get us there, and what would we find there would be something that would tell us about ourselves, which is both living living beings and ancient beings and spiritual beings that would really change our perception about who we were. And then soon after this, combined with our sort of post-war nuclear apocalypse blob kinds of movies, you see Mars sci-fi engaging with basically monster movies, and this is really kind of a goofy but fun film that is in that genre, where again the science of us getting there is less the point than, if we're going to have monster movies, why not have them on Mars? Then soon after this, kind of a jumping to a real paradigm shift, and it's an interesting moment for those of you who've seen Capricorn One, which is a post Viking Lander movie, but also a post Nixon administration Watergate movie. The idea that we could fake a Mars landing, and that the thing that we wouldn't find fake is the Mars landing. Because even in this movie, which is about the faking of a Mars landing, nobody said that's not Mars. Because why, Jim?
Well, indeed, the Viking Landers, two really spectacular landing systems, sat down and began to dig in the dirt looking for life. They had three major life-finding experiments on them. But indeed, the vistas that you see were very Mars-like, as what they reproduced in Capricorn One. The fascinating aspect of Capricorn One also blends in the reduction in the space program. Now that we'd gone to the moon, NASA's budget was 4% of the discretionary budget that Congress manages and hands out, and it was rapidly dropping. Today, NASA's budget is only less than 0.5%. And so, can we do everything? If the expectation is after the moon you go to Mars and you don't have enough money to do it, the idea is, well, can we fake it? And that was Capricorn One.
And it's a great Mars movie for those reasons, because it gets Mars right, it gets NASA right, and it's a new kind of way to think about what narratives about Mars might be. And as you can see, it does look very much the same. Jump ahead a little bit to Total Recall, which brings us back to where we were in Mars narratives of finding signs of ancient civilizations there, especially signs that might begin to resolve a climate question. These questions come back again with Kim Stanley Robinson. But most of people think about this movie as just an Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie, but it's also really very much a Mars movie, and it's a Mars atmosphere movie. And they do indeed find signs of ancient civilization. And then coming
what
here,
I really what I really liked about the movie too is that the more we learned about Mars from our orbiters and our landers, they tried to incorporate, and that is the huge valleys and the tall mountains and the vistas that you indeed see in Total Recall are pretty realistic. Mars has these accentuated features because the gravity is lower, and even though shield volcanoes can build up to be huge and enormous, not only tall but very large, you really get these huge scales on Mars. Beautiful vistas.
So we begin to be familiar, as it were, with Mars landscape over time, and the great 2000 movie Mission to Mars, which includes part of its plot point was again the 1976 Viking image of the famous face on Mars, which we didn't really see what it really was for some years, but right in the middle of this, we have a movie about going to Mars and about discovering this face, and again, a kind of ancient civilization narrative.
In fact, the interesting thing,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say the interesting thing about this movie scientifically is they needed to get it out right away because the Mars Global Surveyor had a higher resolution imager than the Viking. And for the first time, we were able really to look at this is not a face so much as it is a mound that is being modified by aeolian processes.
And yet, could it be a face? We don't know. Once we get there, we might blow the dust off like in the movie. But these movies, we begin to see more and more realism about the technical problems of actually getting there. If the old style movies just set the rocket down, now you can see we have lots of concerns about how to land, including in Red Planet, the Val Kilmer movie, was a great scene of this, what's it called, a bubble lander?
Well, these are airbags. They're made of Kevlar. Actually, they're double, and they're designed to literally bounce on the surface of Mars until it comes to rest, and then you deflate the bags, and then you roll off the platform, and you're on the surface. And indeed, this was the concept that we used for Sojourner several years before the Red Planet, but also used it again for Spirit and again for Opportunity, just a couple years after this movie came out.
So we see a kind of blending, and this is another kind of finding crazy life on Mars narratives, combining with the science of the time and the robot. We'll see more of the robot and it later, and the drones later. But we see even in the suits here a beginning to again meld together of the imaginative and the scientific. Um, there's a great movie, which I discovered I hadn't seen before, Stranded, a Spanish movie from the same era, a little bit more of the Pillsbury Doughboy kinds of suits that you'll talk about later. That they, again, it's a kind of pre-Martian, the Martian stranded movie, shipwreck movie, where in their desperation they go into one of the caves and find water and find enough greenery to make an atmosphere. So we see a little bit moving away from the science, but to the speculative, what could be there. Soon after this, then, let me see here. Oops, let me stuck here for a second. We see the science. Yeah, discuss how we start to know more about the planet.
Well, I have to tell you, we're in this fabulous era. This last 20 years of discovering Mars has just absolutely exploded because we now have learned to do it right. About half the missions we've sent to Mars, as David Southwood and I talked earlier today, failed. They missed the planet or crashed or couldn't get into orbit, all kinds of problems. And we've been able to methodically understand those and overcome them. Now we see a multinational effort going on. We have Russians working with the European Space Agency with their trace gas orbiter. We see the Indians with Mars orbiting mission. We also see the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and China, in addition to NASA with these fabulous assets. And of course, the UK is involved not only in ESA, but has built part of a fabulous seismic instrument that is currently on the surface of Mars with InSight. Now we're learning much more. Now, what we're teasing out is much more of the elemental composition, the mineralogy of the planet, and we're realizing how similar to Earth it is. It has carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. The soils are moist and they have nitrates in it. And from that, a new era of science fiction can explode based on these new observations.
So what we can have is now the more that we know, the more we can imagine life actually taking place there, which lends itself to a different kinds of stories. And for those of you who watch The Expanse, it is just taken as a fact that Mars has become a home for humans. It is just taken as a given. We just skip right over the getting there so that we then it becomes just a central fact. And oops, we're next big film, the next big science fiction film, though, gets us between The Expanse and normalcy to how we might turn what we know into an exciting narrative of shipwreck.
Indeed, and that's the book The Martian by Andy Weir. Andy actually started it out as a serial, posting a chapter at a time. He would sometimes spend several weeks once he got Mark Watney into trouble to get him out of trouble. But his approach was always physical based, the ability to use chemistry and geology and everything else at his disposal, as if he was really on Mars, was really important. In fact, Andy felt, and he had told me, that he needed to get this out right away before Curiosity landed and discovered new things that he hadn't incorporated in his book. So this is what we would call hard science fiction. Taking the knowledge, the current knowledge that we have, and then extrapolating it into what might be just a few decades from now.
And part of his telling the story is what I like so much about the science fiction, and rather than sort of big, broad palette of monsters or ancient civilizations, the granular questions of, for example, things like how would he survive on Mars? And how do these suits actually work? And if you can use them for just more than a day or exploration, how would you live for a year in these suits? And I think as you said, you worked very closely with the filming of this with Ridley Scott's group in what this might actually look like.
Indeed, Ridley Scott called NASA headquarters and said, I want to talk to somebody that knows something about Mars, because he was now going to make the movie The Martian. And that fell on my desk. And after talking to Ridley Scott and his team, I realized he wanted to make it visually stunning, but scientifically accurate in the same mold that the book was written. And so we toured JPL, we toured Johnson Space Center. We talked about designs of spacesuits. And at that time, we had, in addition to the EVA suits, what I've called Pillsbury Doughboy suits that you see on the far left, that we use in space for repairs. We also had started the concept of surface suits. And here's Deva Newman, and she was brought into NASA to help design some of these surface suits. They're not completely designed at that time, but knowing that the art directors of the film The Martian used a blending of not only the EVA suit but the surface suit to come out with what I think is a beautiful surface suit, functional surface suit that Mark Watney is wearing.
And one of the needs of cinema is the need for the facial close-up. This has just become a trope. This is just how we watch movies. We get into somebody's face. So to have a suit that allows us to see in a fictional way, allows us to have that sort of sense of Matt Damon there as a movie hero and Mark Watney to be able to get in close to the suit. Because one of the things that you'll notice when you see a lot of Mars movie is they need to take off their hat. They need to take off their hat at the end of a day, and it just becomes a thing. So in part, the discovery of life and a discovery of oxygen is a way then for us to get to be close to the characters. Let me see, getting here. And you couple other things here. You very much, one of the things that we always see in Mars movie is the cleaning of the solar panels. It's always a thing because we know from science that there's dust.
Indeed, here we see in the bottom left, two beautiful views of Spirit, for which it's clean sitting down on the surface and then the dust is accumulated. Now, Spirit and Opportunity were designed only to last maybe 90 days because the thinking was the dust would settle out. These were solar run systems. We didn't really have the capability to have radioisotope power at the mass that we could actually land at that time. But what happened is we discovered dust devils. This swirling of the Mars atmosphere seems to be pervasive, and they would clean off the solar panels. and the rovers would come back to life. And Spirit lasted for 6 years, Opportunity for 13 or 14 years. Really phenomenal.
So we see again, things like our knowledge of the planet, our beginning to map the planet, become plot devices and become ways that we can make a realistic. We don't have to have that realistic view in Total Recall. We can just imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger going through his tunnels to get to this place. But as we know more, the thrust is to try to use what we know to say, okay, this could really happen.
Yeah, in fact, here is Pathfinder, which is the platform that the Sojourner rover landed on that Mark Watney found. He actually had to travel a significant distance to get to it, more than 500 kilometers, bringing it back, dusting it off, and enabling him then to communicate. And so that ended up being a very important aspect of his connection back to Earth.
So one of the things that we want to perhaps throw out to the world is what Mars Sci-Fi hasn't yet imagined. What is it that the more we know about Mars, what this could open up in terms of technological challenges, in terms of imaginative challenges. And we were discussing the other day that while drones on Mars, helicopters on Mars is relatively new factually, it didn't need to be relatively new fictionally. We could have had drones on Mars for decades. The only one was Red Planet that had this with the kind of Amy drone, scary technological go awry story. But what was it about Mars that we didn't imagine there to be helicopters on Mars?
Well, this is a case indeed for which science kind of pushed that envelope. And I think that's going to open up all kinds of new ideas, both scientifically, but with science fiction.
I think it's interesting because the science fiction on Mars is almost entirely walking and some rovers, but we haven't gotten a flight on Mars, even though fictionally anything is possible. And in thinking through the National Geographic, this is more kind of a blend of factual fiction, of imagining what life would be like in the short term with these habitats and with these kinds of rovers.
Yes, this series, they put out actually 2 seasons, 8 or 9 episodes each season, was really all about landing and living and working on the planet, and then finding what they needed to have, which was a base hidden from intense radiation by going into a collapsed lava tube. So how did they find those lava tubes?
And then just to sum us up, this could be the base camp for some of our next big Mars movies, with drones everywhere, with habitats, with a base camp to imagine what life could be like, or what our narratives could be like in the next iteration, because we don't know what the next stories will be like. And I was going to say, I didn't want to stop there. This is where I was going to stop. Is this a good place to stop and talk a little bit more generally?
Yeah, perhaps we have a few minutes left, unfortunately, just a few. But let me turn it over to Dallas and Susie and see if you have some questions for us. But the future on Mars is bright, and not only from a human exploration point of view, but from a science fiction point of view too.
I was Susie had never seen Total Recall before, and so I was showing her the famous eyeball exploding thing. I'm like, how could you not have seen Total Recall?
And here's the funny thing: when I do a lot of work with young people, and I have a vacuum chamber, and I boil water in it, and I have marshmallows exploding, all those kind of things. And then Dallas showed me that clip, and I thought, yeah, I've never seen it. We need to show that to the kids. Like, this is what happens. Although obviously it's not.
Well, I thought about I wasn't quite sure how young the viewers would be, and I certainly
think it's
didn't
a bit
want
gruesome.
to have.
It's not that
gruesome.
I think that was a good call. Yeah, funny. I think that was a good call. Not to
Susie
show
had
that.
never seen Alien either, which was another kind
Oh
of...
my
That
goodness.
was a revelation. Yeah, I'd never seen
exactly.
it. I'm really jumpy, so I'd never seen Alien, and I was watching it with Dallas, and I said, if there's anything jumpy, just let me know. And not once did you warn me. Honestly, I jumped out of my seat 100 times. It was terrifying.
I'll tell you my favorite sci-fi film at the moment, and it's not a Mars one, but it's a Moon one, and it was made in 1920 something. It's a Fritz Lang's Frau im Mond. It's called Woman of the Moon.
Yes.
And a bit like Jim Green, the scientific advisor was Hermann Oberth, the great sort of German rocket scientist of the 1930s. They got him on. And again, a little bit like The Martian and the work that you did, it's very prophetic. There's all the kind of moon stuff, the rocket itself and their journey to Mars, the overview effect, the shot of them, the close-up, the close-up trope of them looking back at the Earth. All came true. It all happened in sort of the Apollo years. So I love that. I love everything you're talking about, that beautiful balance and that dance between the imaginative and the scientific. It's a lovely thing.
Yeah, Carl Sagan really said that best, that it's a really quite the dance between science and science fiction. And that's true. If you don't have, you really have to have time to think about your future, or you won't have a future. And science fiction is a very important part of the process. We take a lot from science fiction. When I was working with Ridley Scott's design team on various aspects of the movie, I took them into a habitat that NASA has and showed them around. Here's what the Mars habitat will look like. This is what we're building now. And Art Max, who is the designer, and his camera, he's taking all these pictures and he's going, well, what about this? Where's this? Where's that? And I kept saying, Art, we haven't invented it yet. You have to invent it because you're doing the movie. Okay.
It's your job.
Sorry,
so make it good. Yeah, just make it good because we might like it. We might do it. And indeed, he did a fabulous job.
So one of the problems. Oh, I was going to say one of the problems it's become a trope in science fiction and spaceships, right? The long hallway, right? You can go on the web and write spaceship hallway, right? As if there's going to be endless place, right? When the reality is, as these tabs show, it's tiny. But our film narratives and the way we have fiction is we have people being mad at each other and going out and slamming the door and, sulking off and going to your room. And part of the new kinds of narratives that we're going to need is people stuck really close together and not being able to.
It's a very good point. I think about ships like the Nostromo, for example, and how much the Nostromo just fed into the kind of our own psyche, that darkness, shadows, dripping. It was just it's the perfect.
Dripping,
it's a really good thing. Actually, the other thing I noticed as well was the new SpaceX suits were designed by a Hollywood costume designer, and I think Elon Musk, a bit like Walt Disney at the time, or a bit like, Werner von Braun, was a big. These were showmen. They understood that if you want to get people on board, you've got to excite them. And so, well, why not get a Hollywood costume designer to design the spacesuit and make them look badass? I don't particularly
You don't like them, yeah.
I don't like them. I like spacesuits to look gnarly and a little bit ugly, like the kind of the Russian Sokol suit that they wear on Soyuz. I like that. I don't want
with valves sticking out. You got to have some valves somewhere.
Yeah, I need valves.
And there's a sense in which, again, as science fiction and Mars movie very much mapped onto, at least in the Western tradition, is the Western, right?
Yes.
And the gunslinger.
Yeah.
There is the gunslinger, and there's that way that Mark Watney does sort of strut around with his, duct tape and his, like a Western hero, and questions, this question of colonization, or question that Bradbury talked about very much in the Martian Chronicles, has a kind of resonance in as Mars movies get more woke, right? Of how that could be. We're working our understandings of the Western and what that means politically into the Mars movies.
Yeah, they become familiar.
Yeah. I always wanted the Mark Watney character to be more like the Ripley character in Alien. One of the things I loved about Alien was because in Alien, when in the last third of Alien, there is no dialogue. It's her trying to get off the Nostromo before it blows. And it's a classic Hitchcock. It's a chase movie. It's every kind of, thriller trope. And my problem with The Martian, the Mark Watney character, there was too much talking in it, which actually it took away from the imaginative quality of it. It was too kind of, I found that just the dialogue of The Martian, it was too on the nose, and it didn't leave enough room for that, the sort of darkness that you got with, if you just took Mark Watney's dialogue out and just had him doing the stuff, you could have built that kind of tension. That's what I think.
Well,
anyway.
the other aspect of the movie, and there's a couple of them that really ring true for NASA, is that the crew was very compatible. You could tell the teams. NASA builds great teams. For instance, yes, Mark Watney was part of the Hermes crew. They were a team. But also Mitch Henderson back at NASA headquarters was representing that team. He was as much a part of that team as if he was sitting on the Hermes himself or with Mark Watney. And so that's what you have. That's what we need. We need the voice of each and every one of those teams in the decision-making process.
Yes.
And then they have to be, as we all pointed out, very compatible. Tight spaces, tough times, working together. We must think about what's happening on space station today. We have 5 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts at a time when we have to work together. They are dependent on each other, no matter what their background, their culture, or the politics of the time.
Well, I think one of the great stories, and it's not a science fiction story, but the Shuttle Mir story, when we, again, like you say, this is the precursor to the International Space Station. Of course, there were problems like Mike Foale when the Progress ship crashed into Mir and put a hole in it, and they had, that's a story that's never really been told sort of properly, and how they managed to get out of that script. And that's cosmonauts and astronauts together in a very, very tight, confined space with a ticking clock. I always thought that would be. Well, there was there was a Russian sci-fi movie based on Salyut 7, I think.
Salyut 7, fabulous movie, unbelievable.
Is it good? I've never seen it.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
The Salyut 7 story is an incredible story.
Yeah, I happened to be in Moscow at the time, and the movie was released at the anniversary of the Sputnik. I was invited to the Kremlin to see it with about 2,000 or 3,000 Russians in the audience, and although it was all Russian, I had an interpreter just giving me little sound bites, but actually I didn't need it because you could see the tension. You could see how they had to work together to overcome just an enormous problem. So I highly recommend Salyut 7.
Next movie night.
It's the Russian equivalent of Apollo 13 is sort of essentially.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is exactly.
And I was going to say that in a funny way, this Teams very much maps onto an old trope, which is the heist movie. Right. And the heist movie trope is a whole bunch of people that have to work tightly together. Who's going to blow the safe? Who's going to drive the getaway car? Who's going to do this? But you can see how science fiction, especially with Mars and space travel, maps onto our fictional assumptions.
That's right. So in The Martian, it was tremendously suspenseful. And it's not because the guys were fighting over the girl, or the girls, whatever it happens to be, the interpersonal relationships. It was really about humans versus nature, which is tough enough to overcome in such a tough environment as Mars will be. It's going to be high adventure when we do it.
And about problem solving as well. It's that sort of puzzleification. How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to, whatever the problems were. Right. It was nice. It was, good stuff. Hey, do we have any questions from the audience? We've lost our iPad.
We've got David Southwood actually on the line as well. If he wants to leap in with any questions he wants to ask you, then he can do.
I've been asking people what their favourite sci-fi movies are. Do you have a kind of particular one you go to, each of you?
Well, for Mars, to me, it's The Martian. Yeah.
Martian.
I hope you say that.
Yeah. And I saw Alien when it first came out with my wife in the theater, and that it stuck with me as such a paradigm shifting, women take charge, horror in space. Film. I mean, it just was fabulous. So that's my favorite space movie of all time.
And I liked in this round, that's all I've done for the last 2 weeks is watch Martian movies and read Martian books. And I really liked this Spanish one on from 2001, Stranded, because it sort of took a lot of the gender politics. Once they were stranded, the women were just like, the object of desire and reproduction from astronaut, which was realistic and annoying. So it was kind of nice. I see that there's some good questions here about how many in the chat. Are you guys not able to see the chat?
Let's have a look.
Struggling slightly. You go ahead though.
Yeah, one of them said, how was Mars created? Which was a good question.
Yeah.
Jim?
So Mars was created 4.6 billion years ago. At the same time Earth was accreted, Mars was accreted. So within the first 10 million years of our collapsing cloud, after the sun got going, all the planets were created. The fabulous thing about it is it's created with pretty much the same material. But as you see, as you go further out in the solar system, you have different types of material. You have gas giants that are out there that are accumulating a lot more mass and therefore a lot more of the gases. So we always wanted to figure out, well, what does Mars have? Does it have a combination of more gases inside it based on where it is formed, or more of the terrestrial-like rock of the planet? And now we know it's much more Earth-like.
So there's a couple of more questions having to do with how many Mars movies, and there's just more than anybody could watch. So just Google them.
Yeah, that's a challenging one. We're not expecting you to come up with a number on that one. That's tricky.
Yeah, no, not going to do a number. This one good question here: has there any data on the impact of sci-fi on science? Well, this is basically every conversation I have with Jim.
I can just tell you, I watched the original Star Trek. I watched Captain Kirk flip his communicator and talk to Scotty, orbiting above them. And when I was there with Art Max, and we were talking about the technologies, I said, Art, I pulled out my iPhone. I can call an astronaut on the International Space Station right now. That's science fact. But in 1966, it was complete science fiction when Captain Kirk did it.
Absolutely.
So we see no, go ahead.
Every scientist I've met, or every astronaut I've met, they come from science fiction. They watch science fiction movies, and that's part of what makes them tick.
Except for this one.
Apart from this one, he doesn't watch any science fiction.
And the idea is, I should say that my background is not science at all, though my parents were engineers. I'm a literature professor. And if you think about all literature as a matter of world building, right? You create characters, you create scenes, and they could be realistic or they could be set on Mars. And I've taught Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for years, for example, which is, some say, a kind of early science fiction, the idea of creating life. And the idea is, what can you imagine? And speaking of Star Trek, like, we're how many centuries away from beaming technology, and yet when you're watching Star Trek, I believe they're beaming. Do you believe they're beaming?
They're
beaming.
We have that willing suspension of disbelief. We all appreciate the sort of artistic license. I'm really happy we've got an English professor. I'm also in English. I read English at university.
Excellent.
So I'm happy we've got a couple of arts graduates.
Yes, we're at home in
standing
science.
Up for the humanities.
I think one of the other technologies that you once mentioned, Jim, has predated or came out of the imagination before science was laser beams, right? And tractor beams. Yes,
I mean, in a lot of the science fiction literature and movies, you always had the ray gun, and indeed, but from Buck Rogers, you name it, in the 30s, and it really didn't come about until the late 50s. When the idea of focusing on very narrow wavelengths and what those wavelengths could do, and then how to create those. And those are created in lasers. So that indeed preceded, the idea really preceded science by many decades.
One of the
Yes.
last questions I see here was, what is the most frustrating space movie? And in fact, I'm going to talk about one that we didn't talk about here, which was John Carter, which is the Edgar Rice Burroughs Barsoom series. And there never was one called John Carter, but it was Princess of Mars. And it's an interesting movie, and I should say this as a kind of way of understanding Mars movies in the history, at least in the American Western perspective, is that John Carter was a Confederate soldier, right? And this was the afterlife of him, is going to Mars and having a kind of do-over after the awfulness of the Civil War. So when you think about the history of going to Mars as an escape from calamity and conflict on Earth, it's both a warlike place, a do-over place, maybe we can try again better place, and then I think that resonates for today.
Yeah, right.
That sounds like a good note to end on,
Yeah,
actually.
I think so.
Great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us. What a
Thank
fantastic
you.
end to Mars Day. Thank you for this
Yes,
wonderful last session.
Perfect ending of Mars Day. Thank you both.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I could talk
And
about,
thank you, Hollis.
space movies.
Thank you.
Right, I could just go on.
Yeah.
Actually, the best space movie is Close Encounters, actually.
It's good.
It's a slightly forgotten space movie, and it's a work of art, and no one ever talks about Close Encounters and these things.
Yeah,
but-
you're
That's
right.
a good one.
Yeah, it is.
Oh,
It's
Arrival
great
is
one.
your-
Arrival is my favorite. Have you
Yeah,
seen
Arrival's another wonderful one. Yeah, that's right.
Did they come from Mars? I'm trying to, it came from far
I don't
away,
think
but
it was
I think
ever.
you're right.
Yeah, it was
Aliens
ever
don't
said.
come from Mars anymore. They're always kind of interdimensional now. Because once we realized there was nothing on Mars, in the 1950s it was aliens from Mars, green men from Mars.
Correct.
And then there was nothing. I
We know there's nothing on Mars. Dallas is sort of stepping slightly ahead of science
I didn't mean. You know what I mean?
Cancel all the Mars missions.
I
Dallas
mean,
says there's nothing on Mars.
Once we realized the canals weren't,
I'm joking.
and there wasn't a giant eye growing out of Mars and all that kind of stuff, then the
Well, I have
aliens.
to tell you, Rosalind Franklin digging into the surface. Life could have started on Mars because it was a blue planet when the Earth was a blue planet, and when life started on Earth. So life could have come on the surface and gone, but of course, as the environment gets tougher to live in, life moves into the rocks. So indeed, if we're going to find life on Mars, it's below the surface. So hang tight.